Well, welcome to Behind the Music. I'm St. John Flynn, and this time we're joined by somebody who has collaborated with the Houston Chamber Choir on several occasions, Jamie Bernstein. Jamie, welcome.
Thank you, St. John. Very nice to be with you today.
And you are where in the world?
In the world, I am in Fairfield, Connecticut, where my family has a country house that we've been in since I was a little girl. And it's a beautiful place and it's very close to the city, so it's easy to get here. And usually I'm here for just a few days at a time. And, for holidays and family gatherings, birthdays, and times like that, or, when I can catch a weekend, I dash up here. But I've never been here for so long at a stretch as I have during the COVID pandemic, where it turned out to be the ideal lockdown situation.
And everybody in the family is safe and sound?
Knock on wood. We're all okay, thank you. Yes.
That's wonderful.
I hope the same for you as well.
Yes, indeed. I normally start these interviews by asking a sort of baseline question, and that is, did you grow up in a musical family? But that question seems sort of irrelevant for you.
Oh, no, we didn't have any music. Music, what's music?
Your father, Leonard Bernstein, obviously a great conductor and composer and music educator. Your mother as well was a musical person, wasn't she?
She was. She was Felicia Montealegre. She was from Chile in South America, and she was incredibly gifted, also a pianist and an actress, wonderful painter and sculptor, and beautiful and witty and quick on the trigger, and her friends totally adored her. So she was quite a formidable character unto herself.
And she was taught piano lessons from Claudio Arrau.
That's right, Claudio Arrau, the famous pianist, also from Chile, like her.
Chile. Well, I mean, I guess it's easy to assume that because of who your parents were, that it was an incredibly musical household. But is that necessarily the case?
Well, we're all very musical, and we all live and breathe music. We listen to it all the time. We have musician friends. We go to concerts. We're constantly talking about music, and we always have some piece of music stuck in our heads. So that's a lot of our conversation is, what's the tune in my head today? And so it's just part of the fabric of life.
What's your earliest memory of music in the home?
Boy, that's a good question. I mean, there was no time when there wasn't music, obviously. And when I was very young, I remember my parents playing two pianos together, but my mother got shyer about that as she got older, and she stopped doing that. I also remember that when my sister was born, our mother could get Nina to stop crying in her crib by playing Brahms or Schumann on the piano. And I also have very early memories of having immense emotional reactions to certain kinds of music. So for example, when I was in school, I couldn't have been in more than first grade. We were taught the Christmas carol called The Friendly Beasts. Do you know that one?
No, I don't.
It's all, every verse is about a different animal around the manger where Jesus has just been born. And so I said the cow, so fat and wise, or whatever the lyrics are. La, 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 la. The friendly beasts around him stood. Okay, so that phrase, the friendly beasts, used to make me just tremble with emotion. There was something about that little interval, la la, like that little minor third that just, there was something so tender about it that I practically couldn't stand it. And I used to get into my closet and close the door in my closet, just leave it open a gap so I could see, and sing it to myself until I cried. So, but you know, why was that so moving? I have no idea now.
It wasn't just classical music that was in your house, though, was it?
Far from it. Well, my father always was interested in popular music of all kinds. I mean,
right.
The whole thing about him was that he never made a value judgment between one kind of music and another. So right. He was equally excited by good music of any stripe. And growing up as a kid, he listened to the radio all the time. So he was up on all the popular music of his era, but he stayed interested in popular music all his life. So he was really into Elvis Presley, and then, but I was a little too young for Elvis Presley. When I came in, it was the Beatles, 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 Beatles. And luckily for me, my father loved the Beatles too. I mean, he was, you know, not madly obsessed with them like I was, but he really admired their music. And he thought they were incredibly inventive songwriters, super melodic. He loved their vocal harmonies. And so we spent a lot of time listening to Beatles music and talking about it. And that was one of the real goodies of my childhood.
So your parents actively engaged you in music. They would talk to you about music. It wasn't just a, you know, something that they did while you sat in the other room.
Oh no, music was, it was just part of everything. But what did not go so well were the piano lessons. My brother and sister and I all had piano lessons, and we all had bad attitudes, and we never practiced except in that sickening half hour before the piano teacher showed up at the house on Tuesday afternoon.
I think we've all been there.
I would run to the piano and try to master in 20 minutes what it was I was supposed to have been working on all week, but hadn't been. And it was sickening. But the thing was, you know, I was hearing music being generated at its optimum all around me all the time. So when I sat down at the piano and these awful little frogs and spiders would come out of my fingers, I would just be so discouraged. And, you know, I got this voice in my head that would say, oh, who do you think you are and what do you think you're doing? And forget it. You'll never get there. It's hopeless. Why bother? That was sort of the feeling I had about making music myself as a child. It wasn't until I found a guitar in the closet and figured out how to play the songs I heard on the radio on the guitar that I found a way to make music something of my own.
Whose was the guitar? Who did it belong to?
Somebody gave my father a classical guitar, you know, a big clunky Spanish guitar with enormous frets, very hard to play, actually. Mm-hmm. But you know, I found it in the closet where my father had ignored it completely because he's not a guitar player. But I had gone to a day camp where they gave us little folk guitars for a month and taught us 3 chords. And so we learned a couple of little tunes, and that was enough to get me started. So then when I found the guitar in the closet, I was all excited. I thought, oh, I have my own guitar now. You know, I had to give back the one at camp. Yeah, and so right. I got new strings and I tuned it up just like they taught me at camp. And then I had my own instrument. So that was a way to make music something that I could have agency over.
Do you remember what was the first music that you came to yourself? The first music, for example, that you went out to buy, like LPs, etc.
Oh, yeah.
Do you remember that?
I do. Well, I remember the very first 45 RPM record, mm-hmm. the little ones, right. that I acquired. I was too young to go to a record store by myself and buy it. I actually requested of my father that he buy me Let's Dance by Chris Montez. I don't know why I fixated on that song. It's not all that exciting, but that was the record I wanted. And that was my first 45.
And did you purchase many? Did you put together a sort of a record collection?
Of course, that's what we did back in those days. And you know, it's very hard for me as an adult now to get used to the idea that the music that you own isn't tangible. For us, it was so tactile to hold those records in your hands and hold the covers in your hands and read the lyrics in your hands and you know, clean the record or not, you know, with a cloth or your, you know, the sleeve of your shirt or whatever we did, but it was tactile. You know, that's what it was all about. And so first I had that big collection of 45s in a handy dandy little box. And then as I got older, albums became more important. I really was living at the perfect time for all of this popular music because, you know, the times and the music were changing just as I was getting old enough to appreciate the changes. So when albums were coming in, and then concept albums were coming in, I was reaching the right age to appreciate all of that. And I would say that the absolute apex of that moment was being 14 years old when Sgt. Pepper came out, which was, you know, the ultimate Beatles album, and it was a concept album, and it was so out there. It as we all know, it really broke new ground in so many ways, having to do with the recording process and the songwriting process and how you assemble an album and in the cover and the whole phantasmagoric psychedelic aspect of it. It really did truly blow my mind, that record.
I think that was one of the, as you say, one of the things that we perhaps have gotten away from is that tangibility, if you like, because the album covers took on a life of their own, but also the liner notes is something that we don't appreciate today in the same way that we did back then, because
there's no such thing anymore.
You could hold the cover and you could read the notes, and there were awards for the quality of the liner notes, weren't there?
There were. And that was so much a part of the experience too. And I remember when I first listened to Sgt. Pepper with my friend Lucy, and we lay down on the carpet in her parents' study with the record on the record player. And there we were on our stomachs with the album cover and the lyrics in our hands, just, you know, inhaling the whole experience through all our senses, you know.
Who was your favorite Beatle?
Who do you think?
Paul.
No. John Lennon, of course.
John.
It was all about John Lennon. Not just because he was edgy and beautiful and kind of smart, and anyway, I love John Lennon, but I also loved him because of his poetry. My father and I were both really into John Lennon's poetry. His first book of poetry was called In His Own Right, W-R-I-T-E. And we were obsessed with those poems, and we memorized a lot of them. And my father even made up a game for him and my brother and me to play in the hammock after dinner in the summer. And the game was with the song, the poem that we took was called The Moldy Man, which I will now recite for you. It's very short. I'm a moldy, moldy man. I'm moldy through and through. I'm a moldy, moldy man, though you would not think it true. I'm moldy till my eyeballs. I'm moldy till my toes. I will not dance, I shy balls. I'm such a humble Joe. That's the poem. The game that my father invented was that we would sing it as a round, you know, like Frère Jacques or Row, Row, Row Your Boat. But the reason the game was fun is that whoever went first got to invent the tune and decide what the melody would be like. So, you know, my father might start, I'm a moldy, moldy man, and I'm moldy through and through, and you know, like that. but of course he's making it up and he's going along. And in a round,
Right.
you have to be saying your line and listening for the next line at the same time so that you can say the next line after the person going ahead of you, right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
You can't do it. It's an absolute guaranteed car wreck every single time. And so that was the fun of it, was that it was such a mess. And then the other really fun part of it is that whoever went last, and I always liked it when my brother went last, because whoever went last was left all alone singing, "I'm such a humble Joe," or whatever the tune was. So
Bringing
it was
up
an
the rear.
incredibly fun game. It was a really fun game. And it's just a mess of a game.
Do you still listen to those albums today?
You know, that's a good question. Actually, my relationship to the Beatles is so intense and so kind of inner that I can't just listen to the Beatles for fun. It's too personal.
Right.
I can't explain it. But like, you know, if I'm shopping in the supermarket and some Beatles song comes over the PA system in some smart Muzak version, like I'm just done in. Like I weep into the cart for a while. I just can't think about anything else. That's the other thing. It can't be background music because I'll be so distracted that I won't be able to continue the conversation with whomever I'm talking to.
I know just what you mean, that I was always a big fan of Genesis, talking of progressive rock and concept albums. And, you know, when I listen to the music, I listen to it, I have to listen actively. It can't just be in the background. You know, I'm listening to the chord progressions, I'm listening to, you know, the lyrics. And I know just what you mean, that it's not something that you can just put on and, you know, flit around the apartment doing your housework.
It doesn't make good wallpaper.
Right. Do you still have your record collection, your vinyl collection?
I do, but I don't have a turntable, so I'm not playing my records. You know, actually, about 10 years ago, I fished out about 5 of my all-time favorite albums and had a friend of mine who worked at the classical radio station in New York, WQXR. I had him rip them onto CDs for me so that I could listen to them properly. So I did do that with a few key albums.
Growing up, yours was a musical household. Do you remember the musicians that came by?
Well, as I said on about the 6th page of my book, let the name dropping begin.
Begin.
You know, I mean, as a little kid, of course, I didn't know who my parents' friends were. You know, when you're little, your parents' friends are just your parents' friends and you have no broader context for who they are in the world. So it wasn't until I was older that I began to perceive that these luminaries traipsing in and out of our house were really something, and that my parents were situated at the epicenter of mid-20th century culture in New York City. So, you know, the musicians who were coming around were amazing. And, you know, a close family friend was Isaac Stern and Aaron Copland. And so they were family friends. And Lucas Foss and Mark Blitzstein, who was my godfather, actually. He, you know, who wrote The Cradle Will Rock and many another thing. And I mean, you know, Rostropovich and Seiji Ozawa and Michael Tilson Thomas and, you know, all those guys and ladies, many women too. So there were lots of amazing people, and in all of the arts, in theater and literature and art and ballet and what did I leave out? Theater. Lots of theater folk.
Do you remember at what point you realized who your parents were?
Oh, well, my brother and sister and I get asked this question quite often. And so we have come up with a semi-joke answer. And the answer is that we were watching the Flintstones. And Betty and Wilma were on their way to the Holly Rock Bowl to hear Leonard Bernstein conduct. And when we heard that, we went, oh, they mentioned him on the Flintstones? Wow, he must have really hit the big time.
Did you watch him on television as well?
Sure. The young people's concerts went immediately on television. And in 1958, I was 5. And so starting in that year, my father was on television, and that was a really big deal. To be on television was a really big deal. I mean, I have to admit the Flintstones came a bit later. But in any case, by the time I was in 2nd grade, my best friend, Lisa, was teasing me and calling me famous father girl. That was her little moniker for me. And I actually took it to be the title of my memoir, my book, which came out 2 years ago. And it is, in fact, yes, called Famous Father Girl. Because my father was on television. And, you know, that's why everybody knew who Leonard Bernstein was.
When you look back over this storied family life, what do you see as being what has it left you with? What has it given you that, you know, that forms, you know, the sort of one of the central parts of who you are, or has it?
It's all about family with us. And my brother and sister and I are very close. We call ourselves the Three-Headed Monster. But we had a perfect template to be a three-headed monster because our dad and his 2 siblings were a three-headed monster as well. And we spent our entire childhoods observing how the 3 of them used to act with each other. They had a secret language. They had all these private jokes. They would cluster together and be rude in social events. They never stopped talking about music and were always singing snippets of symphonies. And so all these components are things that we adopted ourselves in our generation. And we do all those things together. So it's been a great joy. And now, of course, we all have families of our own. Mm-hmm. So the family expands and we're all crazy about each other. The family really huddles. And that's why this house in Connecticut is so important to us, because it's the place where we all gather. And in a couple of weeks, it will be my brother's birthday. And we will all gather for my brother's birthday, as we do every year. And we can't wait, and we'll have a dinner under the grape arbor and give my brother every present we can think of that has to do with bacon, his favorite food. He makes bacon every Sunday, so that's the thing. So stuff like that.
So your brother is Alexander, is that correct? And your sister is Nina. What's the age difference between the 3 of you?
Alexander is much closer in age to me. I came first, and then Alexander came about 2.5 years later. And then about 7 or 8 years after that came Nina. There's actually nearly 10 years between her and me.
Okay.
So she's the baby. But she bossed us around, actually.
Now, your father, obviously being, you know, a great composer, do you ever listen to his music just to listen to his music?
Oh, I listen to it a lot. It comes up a lot, so I don't have to make a special appointment to listen to it because I have so many occasions to hear it anyway. Very often I go to concerts where his music is being performed. And when there are performances of his Broadway shows, I'm very often attending, and it comes up a lot. And so it's, you know, his music is very fresh on my mind. Also, I very often present concerts having to do with his music. So I hear his music that way as well. And I talk about it all the time.
Which, of course, is what you have done with the Houston Chamber Choir on a couple of occasions. Is it, I don't know if this is a fair question or not, Is it difficult sometimes to listen to his music? Does it remind you, obviously it reminds you of him, but does it make you sad?
Yes. In particular, his theater piece Mass is the piece of his that I think has the most of him in it. He really bared his soul through the music in that piece. And it's very tormented, some of it. And so it's very hard for me to listen to it because I feel like all of his anguish is just right there. You can hear it. So that's a tough one for me. It's beautiful, but it's anguished.
Mass was the piece you wrote for the opening of the Kennedy Center, is that correct?
Right.
And it's also it's not just a classical piece. It has a musical breadth to it that really is indicative of your father's whole musical life.
Yeah, that's another reason why the piece is so much him, because it contains all his own inner multitudes. And as I mentioned before, he loved all kinds of music and all genres and didn't make a value judgment between one or the other. And Mass has so many different kinds of music in it, including it has a rock band and a blues band and a children's choir and a grown-up choir and a street band, street chorus, which sings in a Broadway idiom. So there's a little bit of everything in the Mass.
One other aspect of your father's work, and I wonder what effect this had on on you and your education, is he had a penchant for liturgical music, both Jewish and Christian, didn't he?
He did. Well, you know, although my father wasn't a strictly practicing Jewish person, our family didn't belong to a synagogue, for example, and we did celebrate Hanukkah, and Passover was our big holiday because we loved the big family dinner, the Seder and everything. But where you can really track my father's spirituality and his ongoing relationship with his creator is through his music. And you can track it from piece to piece. And really he was having a lifelong wrestling match with his spiritual creator in a way, kind of. And you can hear it in his music and in the texts that he used in his fist at the heavens and saying, if you're up there taking care of us, why is everything such a mess down here? And why are we so horrible to each other? He asks this question again and again in all different ways and in all different kinds of music.
You mentioned your father's spiritual dimension, but both of your parents also had a social dimension. They were both passionate about certain social causes, weren't they? Is that something that they passed on to you?
Very much so. I grew up learning the message from our parents that when you saw an injustice or something was wrong in the world, you spoke up, or you went out and marched in the streets, you made a noise. And I guess we've all passed that along to our kids as well. And we all put on our masks and went out and marched about George Floyd and Black Lives Matter. And, you know, we're still doing it. Yeah. Still doing it.
Your parents created a little bit of controversy because they had some sort of reception for the Black Panther movement.
Yes, they did. It's a very notorious chapter in my parents' life. And I write about it quite thoroughly in my book, if anyone is curious to know more about this ever misunderstood occasion. It was my mother who put together this fundraising event to support the families of these 21 Black Panthers who were in jail waiting for a trial on these completely trumped up charges. having to do with blowing up Bloomingdale's or something in New York City. It was ridiculous. It was nonsense. And when the trial began, the judge threw it out immediately. But meanwhile, they were stuck in jail and the families needed to, survive. And so my mother had this fundraising event to which no press was invited. But a couple of members of the press sneaked in and wrote about it in this super snarky way, because my father arrived at the event midway through from his rehearsal across town. And the minute he walked in, the temperature in the room changed, because that's the kind of person he was. He would just, the minute he walked in, all eyes turned to him. And so the whole event was characterized as his party, not fundraising event with, snacks and beverages, but rather a party for the Black Panthers. It was just completely misconstrued. And then the blowback began. And it was an awful episode for my whole family because we were excoriated in the press. My mother was excoriated in the press. And meanwhile, my father went off to conduct in Europe and escaped the whole flap. But my mother was stuck in New York being our mom. And she was the one who really had to take it on the chin for the whole thing. And Tom Wolfe's essay that appeared later on in New York Magazine, Radical Chic, and then became a book, just, set it in stone, set the whole misunderstanding about the incident in stone forevermore. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to correct the record on this whole business. But I'm resigned to the fact that I will never succeed in correcting the record.
Yeah, no matter what people read, they'll always fixate upon one particular approach to something, and
they will. Well,
their mind is made up.
Minds are made up. As we know, it's very hard to change a mind once you've made something up. And also, Tom Wolfe was a very clever writer, and he made the whole thing really funny. And the phrase radical chic is so catchy that it will never be erased from our conversation. So, we're stuck. What can we do?
Right. I've seen a lovely photograph, black and white photograph, of you sitting on the floor at the feet of your father. He's on the podium conducting a rehearsal, an orchestra rehearsal.
Yes, in fact, it was a rehearsal of a young people's concert. And I remember the moment that the picture was taken, because I was not in the habit of sitting on my father's podium, but this photographer for CBS asked me to do it. And so I did, and then he snapped that picture. And actually the picture is great. It's so good that I used it as the cover of my book.
Right. Did you often sit in on rehearsals?
I did. In fact, one of the most fun things that my brother and I used to do when we were kids was accompany our dad for the entire day of the taping of the young people's concerts. And so it was a whole thing, because you had to get up really early, which my father hated, like at 5, and have breakfast and then cross town in the dawn and go to the hall where my father had a camera rehearsal at 7 a.m. And then at 9 a.m., there was an orchestra rehearsal. And my brother and I were just left completely unsupervised. We could wander all over Philharmonic Hall, anywhere we wanted, and we could go backstage and steal the donuts from this trestle table that was set up for the musicians. So we would steal donuts, and then we would play horse in the corridors, and then we would watch everything from the tippity-toppest chair all the way in the back of the hall, and then we would watch it from down below. Then we would go outside on West 65th Street, where the CBS mobile unit truck was parked, and Roger Englander, the director of the TV show, was sitting inside the truck with all the monitors and the toggle switches, and we would watch him, work the shots with the score in his lap. And it was so interesting and fun. And then there would be a dress rehearsal around noon, which they would tape. just in case anything went wrong at the 2 p.m. performance. And then in between the dress rehearsal and the 2 p.m. performance, there would be this frantic lunch meeting in my father's dressing room because it was always too long for the broadcast and they would have to cut things. And my father never wanted to cut his script, which he'd written himself. So there was this frantic cutting and eating, and this was before Xerox machines. And so the script was on this horrible sort of carbon paper and messy, and they would just have to make all the corrections right there on the same piece of paper all day long. And then in the beginning, there was no teleprompter either. And then my father used to have to memorize his scripts. And in the real beginning, back at Carnegie Hall, before Lincoln Center was even built, it was live television because they hadn't invented videotape yet. So there were all these stages and incarnations of the way these shows were put together. And it was so interesting to track the whole thing. It was really fun.
And it must have been instructive for you to see your father, quote unquote, at work, because that was a side of him that you didn't get to see very often.
We saw it a lot because he invited us in. You know, he always invited us to be around and part of the process and to observe how the music was put together, sit in on the rehearsals, tag along on the orchestra tours. That was the most fun of all. To go, you know, to Europe and Israel and Japan and all these exotic places and fly first class and stay in these really good hotels and go to the rehearsals and go to the concerts and just live the whole experience. It was fantastic.
Looking at your particular musical life, does it have elements that have not come from who your father was?
Oh, well, I would say that the other major element in our lives as a family is our mother, Felicia, of course, and she was from Chile. And so she made a point of raising us bilingual. And this was the greatest unearned gift that we could have been given as children.
Absolutely.
There is nothing more wonderful than growing up bilingual because you don't have to work at it. It just happens. You just inhale it, you know, and you just grow up speaking 2 languages. So that was our incredible good fortune. And I mentioned that my father and his siblings had a private language. Well, our private language in our generation is that we share this special family way of speaking Spanish with all these little private references, many of which have to do with our nanny, Julia Vega, who was with us since I was 2 years old. So that's basically our entire lives until we lost her only like 9 years ago. So, and she had a very particular way of speaking, both in Spanish and English. And so we imitate her voice, and it's a nice way of remembering her too. And also our mother had all sorts of special ways of using Spanish. And so it's a way of remembering when you use language that way.
Was Julia Chilean?
Yes, also, she was.
So your Spanish has a Chilean accent?
Oh, total. Not only does it have a Chilean accent, but we speak as if we were back in the 1950s, because that's the Spanish we learned. And it's like in a time capsule, because we didn't continue to speak it in a contemporaneous way with peers. So, you know, we sound like our grandmother might have sounded in Santiago, Chile back in the 1950s. It's a very kind of archaic Spanish.
Right. Your father was known for many things, for his conducting, for his composing, but also for his role as a music educator. And that is something that you have taken on in your own professional life. And as a narrator, as a presenter of music, what is it that you took from your father and injected into your own presentation of music?
Well, I mean, this is the apple that fell close to the tree, is the teaching apple. I seem to have inherited the same impulse to grab you by the sleeve and say, listen to this. I have to share this with you because I'm so excited about it. That's kind of the vibe that my father gave off in everything that he did, whether he was rehearsing an orchestra or reciting Lewis Carroll or telling a good Jewish joke. It all had that same quality of to reach out and communicate, you know? And that's what made him a good teacher. And it appears that I have something similar because I just love talking about the music that I'm excited about. Right. So it's something that I observed him doing. And the other thing I really observed him doing in his young people's concerts was his way of embracing an audience so that everyone felt included and talked to directly, not talked down to, not condescended to. There was something very immediate and easy about the way he communicated with his audiences, and I really admired that. I try to emulate that.
For your siblings, have they taken on any of that music into their own professional lives?
Music, none. I would say none of us. Well, we're not musicians per se.
Right.
And so, but we are all teachers. As I mentioned, that's the apple that fell close to the tree. My brother was a teacher for many years, and he has started a teaching model, an educational model based on our father's philosophies of education. It's called Artful Learning. And it's not just, let's put the arts in the schools. It's much more. It's let's use the spirit of creativity to infuse the entire school curriculum and connect it all holistically. It's really cool. And there are many schools in the United States now, all over, that are using the Artful Learning method, and it works really great. If anyone's interested in learning more about it, you can go to artfullearning.org online. And so that's what my brother does. And my sister is a chef. And she has spent a lot of time teaching teenagers, not just how to cook, but how to use food to lead healthy lives, and how to teach younger kids, younger than themselves, how to cook themselves. And it's like a whole program that she took to high schools all over New York City. So we're all teachers in our ways.
You mentioned the youth of today. What about the music of today? Are there particular artists, musicians that have really captured your imagination?
There are some. I must say I don't listen to the radio, the pop music stations anymore. And I've gotten very set in my ways. I just turn on that same classical music station that I mentioned earlier, WQXR. And I listen to it all over the world on my computer. And it comforts me. It makes me feel like I'm at home. And I do this little stretching exercise routine on the floor, listening to WQXR no matter where I am in the world. So that's really what I do. But, you know, inevitably, one hears what's going on out there in popular music. And so I'm really crazy about Lizzo. She's my current favorite.
She has a really strong connection to Houston. She studied at the Moore School of Music at the University of Houston.
Oh, she did?
Yes.
And what, she plays the trumpet or something, right? Isn't that her? What's
flute.
Flute,
the
that's
flute.
it, flute. Right. I've seen her play, come to think of it. So yeah.
I'm going to ask you a very unfair question, and I hope that you'll forgive me. But of all of your father's music, do you have a favorite piece?
Oh, well, I get asked this question a lot, and the answer changes all the time because it's usually whichever one I just heard. So, you know, if I just heard a performance of my father's Serenade for violin and orchestra. That is one of my favorite pieces of all time. But if I just saw, the new Broadway revival of West Side Story, oh, I'm back to West Side Story. How can we resist it? Mm-hmm. And so on. So it switches around a lot.
Well, look, Jamie, it's a wonderful opportunity to talk to you. And I appreciate you sharing your musical life with us. And best wishes for the rest of the summer as we are all locked down. Enjoy yourself there in Fairfield, Connecticut. And thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. And it's delightful to talk to you. And thanks for asking such really good questions. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. And thank you to everybody who supports the Houston Chamber Choir, our patrons and our sponsors. Thank you to you for joining us. And we'll see you next time. I'm St. John Flynn. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Houston Chamber Choirs with One Accord is your one-stop shop to choral joy. Help us to continue our mission to grow the esteem and appreciation of choral music by sharing, reviewing, and subscribing to our content. Visit us at HoustonChamberChoir.org.